In the oldest libraries of clay, pressed into tablets 4,000 years ago, there are accounts that trouble the comfortable narratives of ancient history, accounts of cities reduced to dust in moments, of weapons that poisoned the land for generations, of a war among gods that left scars we can still trace in the earth itself. The Sumerians called it the time when the gods made the cities like the storm, when divine conflicts scorched Mesopotamia and changed the course of civilization. The question that haunts researchers is whether these texts preserve memory of actual catastrophes or merely dress human tragedy in mythological language. Welcome. It's good to have you here tonight, wherever you are, whatever hour has brought you to this exploration. Thank you for choosing to spend this time wandering through one of archaeology's most unsettling mysteries, where ancient testimony meets modern evidence in ways that resist easy explanation. The tablets are specific in ways that myth rarely is. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, composed around 2000 BCE, doesn't speak in vague terms about divine anger. It describes an evil wind that came from the west, that killed without visible wounds, that left bodies unburied in the streets. It names cities systematically destroyed: Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Lhasa. Archaeological excavations confirm that these cities show destruction layers from precisely this period, evidence of sudden collapse, mass abandonment, environmental catastrophe. Mainstream scholarship attributes these disasters to natural causes, mythologized through religious frameworks, drought perhaps, climate change, invading armies from the north. The texts in this reading transform human warfare and environmental crisis into cosmic drama, giving meaning to suffering through stories of warring deities. But some researchers, examining the same evidence, see something more complex. They note the peculiar specificity of weapon descriptions, the geographic precision of destruction patterns, the environmental damage that seems to exceed what Bronze Age warfare could inflict. They point to unusual archaeological findings in the destruction layers, to parallel accounts in other ancient cultures, to the possibility that our ancestors witnessed catastrophes we've yet to fully understand. We're not here to settle this debate tonight. Both interpretations rest on legitimate questions about how we read ancient testimony, about what kinds of events leave what kinds of scars, about the relationship between myth and memory. What we're here for is the exploration itself, to trace what the Sumerians actually recorded and what the earth actually preserves. Take a breath. Let yourself settle into this moment, wherever you are. Are you in bed with the room dark around you, sitting quietly with headphones creating a private space? However you're listening, you're exactly where you need to be. Let your shoulders drop, your breathing slow. There's no urgency here, just patient exploration of questions that have waited 4,000 years for answers. If you value content that treats ancient mysteries with both rigor and wonder, that explores controversial topics with intellectual honesty, consider subscribing or leaving a like. It helps others searching for this kind of thoughtful investigation find their way here. Now then, picture the Mesopotamian plain around 2000 BCE, that moment when prosperity turned to catastrophe. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years, suddenly abandoned. Agricultural regions that had fed hundreds of thousands gone barren. Trade networks that connected continents disrupted. Something happened during this period, something significant enough that Sumerian scribes devoted thousands of lines to recording it, composing lamentations that would be copied and recopied for centuries. They described it as divine war, Enlili against Marduk, Ninurta deploying weapons that flew through the air, Nergal bringing plague and fire. The texts speak of brightness that consumed cities, of winds that brought death without visible cause, of lands poisoned so completely that even the birds did not return. Modern archaeology finds the ruins, thick ash layers, evidence of intense heat, dramatic population decline, environmental changes that match the textual chronology with unsettling precision. Tonight we'll examine both the ancient testimony and the physical evidence, exploring what actually happened during this period when Sumerian civilization suffered wounds from which it never fully recovered. We'll look at the weapons described in the texts, the cities marked for destruction, the environmental damage that persisted for generations. We'll consider conventional explanations and unconventional possibilities, treating both with the seriousness they deserve. The same stars that witnessed these events still burn overhead. The same rivers, though shifted in their courses, still flow through Iraq, and the tablets, patient as stone, still speak in the wedge-shaped script that first gave humanity the ability to remember across millennia. Whether the war was between gods or nations, whether the weapons were mythological or material, the scars remain, written in both clay and earth, waiting for us to read them with humility and care. Let's begin before the catastrophe. In the world that existed when Sumer stood at its height, prosperous and powerful, unaware of the devastation approaching, around 2400 BCE, Mesopotamia stood at a peak of prosperity, that would not be matched again for 1,000 years. The land between the rivers sustained perhaps 500,000 people, concentrated in cities whose mud-brick walls rose white against the desert, whose temple platforms climbed toward heaven in stepped pyramids that dominated the horizon for kilometers in every direction. This was Sumer, in its golden age, before the catastrophes the tablets would later describe. The climate during this period was slightly wetter than today, though still arid by most standards. Annual rainfall averaged perhaps 150 to 200 millimeters in the southern plains, barely sufficient for dry farming, but enough to support extensive irrigation networks. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed with reliable abundance, fed by snowmelt from the Zagros and Taurus mountains, their spring floods depositing nutrient-rich silt across the floodplain that made the soil among the most productive on Earth. Agricultural surplus was the foundation of everything. Barley fields stretched for kilometers, their golden expanse broken by date palm groves and vegetable gardens. Sheep and cattle grazed on stubble after harvest. The rivers teemed with fish. Waterfowl darkened the sky during migration seasons. This abundance freed perhaps 20% of the population from food production, allowing specialization in crafts, administration, religion, warfare. The major cities each controlled territories extending 20 to 30 kilometers from their walls. Ur dominated the south, wealthy from maritime trade through the Persian Gulf. Uruk held the central plains, its patron goddess Inanna worshipped across the region. Nippur remained the religious center, politically neutral but spiritually supreme. Lagash and Umma competed bitterly over border territories. Eridu, the oldest city, maintained prestige despite modest size. Trade networks connected Mesopotamia to distant lands. Lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan, 2,500 kilometers to the east. Copper arrived from Oman. Tin, essential for bronze production, traveled from sources possibly as far as Central Asia. Cedarwood from Lebanon. Gold and ivory from Egypt and Nubia. Carnelian from the Indus Valley. These materials flowed into Sumerian workshops and emerged as jewelry, weapons, cult statues, objects of beauty and power. At night the cities glowed with oil lamps, thousands of small flames creating islands of light in the darkness. The air would have carried the smell of burning sesame oil, of bread baking in clay ovens, of incense from temple courtyards. The sounds were human scale, voices in conversation, children playing, craftsmen at work, priests chanting from ziggurat summits, the occasional bleat of sacrificial animals. The sky above was the same sky we see, though the stars turned through slightly different positions. The Milky Way blazed with intensity we've lost to electric light. Planets moved against the fixed stars in patterns the priests tracked with mathematical precision. Venus, Inanna's star, appeared as morning herald and evening guardian in cycles the astronomers had calculated to the day. Perhaps 1 million people lived in Sumer and Akkad combined during this period. Not a vast population by modern standards, but unprecedented concentration for the ancient world. The social organization required to feed, govern, and coordinate such numbers had taken 2,000 years to develop, evolving from village councils to temple bureaucracies to the complex political structures of competing city-states. The system seemed stable, eternal even. Kings came and went, cities rose to dominance and fell to subordination, but the fundamental pattern persisted. Cities centered on temple complexes, agricultural hinterlands supporting urban specialists, trade networks extending across the known world, scribal schools preserving knowledge in cuneiform script, astronomical observations accumulating in temple libraries. Yet stability is always temporary. The irrigation systems that made this prosperity possible also contained the seeds of its destruction. Constant watering in an arid climate raised water tables, bringing dissolved salts to the surface. Over generations the soil grew increasingly saline, crop yields declining year by year. Each generation had to work harder to maintain the output that had come easily to their grandparents. Environmental stress creates political instability. Competition over diminishing resources intensifies. Conflicts that might have been negotiated become wars. The archaeological record from 2400 to 2000 BCE shows increasing fortification of cities, more weapons in burial contexts, inscriptions boasting of military victories over neighbouring states. Climate records from this period, reconstructed through ice cores and lake sediments, suggest rainfall was declining across the Near East. The reliable floods that had sustained civilization for millennia became more erratic. Drought years grew more frequent. The margin between abundance and starvation narrowed. This was the world on the eve of catastrophe, prosperous but stressed, sophisticated but vulnerable. The tablets that would later describe divine warfare were written by people who had known this golden age, who remembered when the cities stood intact, when the fields were productive, when trade flowed freely, and the temples received abundant offerings. What they recorded next was the end of that world, sudden and devastating, a collapse so complete that it seemed only divine conflict could explain it. The earliest references to catastrophic divine warfare appear in tablets dated to around 2200 BCE, though they likely record events from somewhat earlier. These aren't mythological creation stories or timeless legends, but historical accounts, texts that name specific cities, specific rulers, specific consequences. They have the tone of witness testimony, of people struggling to comprehend disasters they had experienced directly. The Curse of Akkad is among the oldest of these texts. It describes the destruction of Akkad, capital of Sargon's empire, by the god Enlil in punishment for King Naram-Sin's sacrilege. The text speaks of Gutian hordes descending from the mountains, but also of Enlil himself bringing devastation through divine weapons. The city was made like the place where the flood had swept, its buildings reduced to rubble, its population scattered. Akkad's location has never been conclusively identified, which itself is strange. It was the most important city in Mesopotamia for 150 years, capital of history's first true empire, yet it vanished so completely that archaeologists still debate where it stood. The texts say it was cursed, that not even a dog would lap water from its wells, that the very site became anathema. Other tablets from this period mention weapons that sound unlike anything in the conventional ancient arsenal. The Era epic, composed around 2000 BCE, but possibly preserving older traditions, describes the war god Era wielding weapons called the Seven, each with specific destructive capabilities. They made the land rebel, overturned cities, brought death to the living, made the mountains collapse. The language is consistent across multiple independent texts. Cities are overturned, a word that suggests sudden, violent transformation rather than gradual siege. Lands are made like after the deluge, evoking the primordial flood that destroyed the antediluvian world, fires that raged in the lands and couldn't be extinguished by water, brightness and brilliance associated with divine combat, light so intense it seems supernatural. The Lament for Sumer and Ur, composed shortly after 2000 BCE, provides the most detailed account. It describes Enlil decreeing destruction upon the cities of Sumer, dispatching the evil wind from the west. This wind brought death without visible wounds. People died in their homes, in the streets, in the fields. Animals perished. Birds fell from the sky. Even fish in the rivers died. The geographic specificity is notable. The text states explicitly that the evil wind came from the west, moved eastward, devastated certain regions while sparing others. Cities to the north, particularly in Akkad, suffered less severely than the southern cities of Sumer. The destruction followed a pattern, affected some areas catastrophically, while leaving others relatively intact. Mainstream scholarship interprets these accounts as mythologized descriptions of political collapse. The Gutian invasions did occur, documented in multiple sources. Climate change was stressing agricultural systems. The Akkadian Empire fell around 2200 BCE, fragmenting into competing city-states. Warfare between these states intensified. The texts in this reading transform human catastrophe into divine drama, making sense of suffering through religious narrative. This interpretation is reasonable and well evidenced. Ancient peoples routinely attributed natural disasters and military defeats to divine displeasure. The pattern appears in every culture with written records. Drought becomes punishment for impiety. Military defeat demonstrates the god's favour toward the victor. Unexplained disasters must reflect cosmic conflict invisible to mortal eyes, but some details resist easy categorization. The weapon descriptions are oddly specific. The geographic precision of the destruction pattern, the environmental damage that persisted long after any plausible human warfare would have ended, the emphasis on mysterious deaths, on contamination that lingered, on lands becoming uninhabitable. Perhaps these texts preserve memory of natural catastrophes we haven't fully identified. Volcanic eruptions can produce clouds of toxic gas that kill without visible wounds. Asteroid impacts or large meteor explosions can devastate regional areas. Epidemic disease spreads along trade routes. Killing seemingly at random. Climate catastrophes can happen suddenly. Tipping points where gradual stress becomes acute collapse. Or perhaps the texts mean exactly what they say, and we lack the vocabulary to recognize what they're describing. Bronze Age peoples witnessing events beyond their experience would use the language available to them. If something flew, it was a bird or an arrow or a divine weapon. If something exploded, it was thunderbolt or divine wrath. If land became poisoned, the gods had cursed it. The texts don't resolve these questions. They simply record what the Sumerians believed happened. divine warfare on a scale that shattered civilization, conflicts between gods that played out in fire and wind and death across the Mesopotamian plain. Archaeological evidence confirms that something catastrophic did occur during the period these texts describe. Multiple cities show destruction layers dated to roughly 2000 BCE. The question is whether the cause was human, natural, or something that doesn't fit comfortably into either category. The weapons attributed to the Anunnaki in these war narratives receive descriptions that range from the conventional to the deeply strange. Some sound like exaggerated versions of Bronze Age armaments. Others suggest capabilities that shouldn't exist in the 3rd millennium BCE, unless we're willing to entertain possibilities that challenge our understanding of ancient technical capacity. Ninurta, the warrior god of Lagash, wielded a weapon called Sharur. The name means smasher of thousands, which sounds like hyperbolic propaganda for a bronze mace or club, but the texts describe Sharur as capable of independent flight, able to scout enemy positions and return to report, able to strike targets at distance and return to its master's hand. It possessed intelligence, held conversations with Ninurta, advised on tactics. Mainstream interpretation sees this as personification of military power, Sharur representing Ninurta's army, or his tactical acumen made concrete through poetic device. The weapon speaks because it symbolizes the god's strategic wisdom. It flies because military force can be projected across distance. Alternative interpretations note the consistency and specificity of these descriptions across multiple independent texts spanning centuries. If Sharu was simply metaphor, why maintain such detailed narrative consistency? Why describe observable flight paths, specific targeting capabilities, return trajectories? The 7 weapons of error receive even more elaborate description. Each had specific effects. One made the mountains collapse, another dried up the sea, a third brought fire in its wake, a fourth made the land rebel. They functioned as a coordinated system, deployed strategically against different targets. The lamentation texts describe the evil wind with chilling precision. It came from the west, always from the west. It moved across the land in a definable path. It killed people, animals and plants. Its victims showed no external wounds. Bodies left exposed remained unburied because people feared contamination. The wind's effects persisted after it passed, lands remaining dangerous, water undrinkable, crops failing, chemical or biological weapons. This interpretation has been proposed. Ancient peoples certainly knew of poisons. Arsenic was used in metallurgy. Plant-based toxins existed. Perhaps sophisticated use of such substances could produce effects the texts describe, but the scale seems wrong, contaminating entire regions, affecting water sources across hundreds of square kilometers, creating environmental damage lasting generations. This exceeds what Bronze Age chemistry could accomplish, unless the knowledge was more advanced than we assume, unless something was lost. The texts also mention weapons associated with light and heat, Nergal's brilliance that consumed cities, the rays that struck from heaven, fires that couldn't be extinguished with water, that consumed stone as readily as wood. Modern readers immediately think of thermite, white phosphorus, napalm, even nuclear fire, but those technologies require industrial chemistry, metallurgy, physics far beyond ancient capabilities, or do they? The texts themselves claim these weapons came from the gods, not from human manufacture. If we take that claim seriously, if the Anunnaki were beings with access to technologies the Sumerians couldn't reproduce, then the descriptions might be accurate within the limitations of Bronze Age vocabulary. This requires accepting premises most scholars reject, that the Anunnaki were something other than mythological constructs, that advanced technology existed in the ancient world, that our understanding of cultural development is incomplete. These are extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence. The physical evidence is ambiguous. We find destruction layers, yes. Evidence of intense heat, yes. But heat comes from many sources. Extensive fire, burning building materials, conflagrations that feed on organic matter stored in cities. We find evidence of sudden population collapse, but disease and drought cause that. We find environmental damage, but irrigation collapse and climate change explain it. What we don't find is unambiguous proof of technology beyond the Bronze Age. No metallurgy that couldn't be achieved with available techniques. No materials that couldn't be sourced from known deposits. No artifacts that clearly exceed period capabilities. Yet absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, particularly for materials that would corrode, for knowledge that could be lost, for objects that might have been deliberately removed or destroyed. The texts remain, patient and unsettling, describing weapons that killed in ways their authors struggled to express, that left damage their descendants could still observe generations later, that seemed to exceed human capacity for destruction. Whether those weapons were real devices, poetic exaggerations of conventional armaments, or mythological frameworks for natural disasters, they pointed toward a period of catastrophe, severe enough to scar cultural memory for millennia. The cities targeted by these weapons were about to learn what such scars looked like. The most comprehensive textual evidence for the catastrophes comes from a genre of Sumerian literature called city laments. Compositions that mourn the destruction of specific urban centres. These aren't brief elegies, but extended works, hundreds of lines long, describing in methodical detail what happened to each city, what it looked like before and after, how the destruction unfolded, who survived and who perished. The lamentation over the destruction of stands as the longest and most detailed of these texts. Composed shortly after 2000 BCE, it describes events the author claims to have witnessed or learned from eyewitnesses. The tone is grief-stricken, but also factual, cataloguing losses with the precision of an inventory. The text opens by describing at its height, walls that reach to the sky, temples gleaming with precious metals, storehouses overflowing with grain and oil, streets bustling with commerce. The goddess Ningal, Ur's patron deity, is shown weeping as she foresees the approaching catastrophe. She pleads with the divine council to spare her city. Her pleas are rejected. Then comes the destruction. Enlil decrees that must fall. He summons the evil wind from the west. The text describes it approaching. The storm, like a great wind, rose up. The evil wind, its companion, rushed after it. People flee to their homes, seal their doors, hide in cellars. It doesn't help. In the city, the storm made the people's blood flow. Death by the storm carried off the living ones. No visible wounds, no obvious cause. People simply died where they stood or sat or lay. The text emphasizes this repeatedly. The mysterious nature of the death, the absence of traditional battle injuries. Animals perished alongside humans, the oxen in their stalls, the sheep in their folds. The storm killed them. Fish in the rivers died. Birds fell from trees. Even insects seemed to vanish. The specificity suggests observation. People noting that the catastrophe affected all life, not just the human targets of divine wrath. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and a separate though related text, provides additional geographic detail. It lists cities systematically. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Larsa, Isun, Kish, Eridu. Each receives similar treatment, described as made like a ruined mound, reduced to dust, abandoned to wild animals. But the text also notes variations. Some cities were utterly destroyed, their populations annihilated. Others were damaged but recoverable. Northern cities, particularly in the Akkadian region, suffered less severely than southern Sumerian cities. This geographic pattern appears consistently across multiple lament texts. The environmental aftermath receives extensive attention. Fields that had been productive became barren. The text states that in the fields and on the hillsides plants failed to sprout. Water sources became contaminated. The fresh water turned salty, the marshes dried up, trade routes were disrupted, caravans ceased travelling, maritime commerce stopped. Mainstream scholarship interprets these laments as responses to the political collapse around 2000 BCE. The third dynasty of fell to Elamite invasion from the east and Amorite pressure from the west. Cities were besieged, some captured and sacked. The irrigation systems, already stressed by salinization, broke down entirely when the centralized administration collapsed. Famine followed. Disease spread through weakened populations. This interpretation accounts for most details. Cities were destroyed in warfare, their populations killed or dispersed. Agricultural collapse did occur, documented archaeologically. Trade networks did fragment. The laments make sense as literary responses to genuine historical catastrophes. Yet certain elements don't quite fit. The emphasis on mysterious death without wounds, the contamination that persisted after the violence ended, the specific directionality of the evil wind, always from the west, the assertion that even birds and fish died, suggesting environmental rather than merely military catastrophe. Perhaps disease explains it. Plague spread by invading armies, killing indiscriminately, leaving bodies that others feared to touch. The geographic pattern could reflect trade routes along which infection travelled. The environmental damage could be consequence rather than cause. Fields left untended during epidemic producing crop failure, or perhaps multiple catastrophes coincided. Military invasion plus climate crisis plus epidemic disease, each amplifying the other's effects. The laments conflate these into singular divine action, because that's how traumatized survivors made sense of overwhelming disaster. The texts preserve what their authors believed happened. Divine warfare producing catastrophe, on a scale that shattered civilization. Whether they're accurate historical records, mythologized interpretations of natural disaster, or something between these categories, they point us toward the archaeological evidence. The cities they name were real. The destruction they describe occurred. The question is whether the tablets can guide us to understanding what actually happened, or whether they obscure historical reality beneath layers of religious interpretation. Archaeologists have excavated extensively at the sites mentioned in the Lamentation texts, and what they found confirms that something catastrophic did occur around 2000 BCE. But the physical evidence, like the textual evidence, allows multiple interpretations. O shows dramatic changes in its archaeological sequence during this period. The city that had been capital of a vast empire, administering territories from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, suddenly contracted. The royal palace complex was abandoned. Temple construction ceased. The population appears to have declined by perhaps 80% within a generation. Leonard Woolley excavated extensively in the 1920s and 1930s, uncovering the ziggurat, the royal tombs, and deep soundings that revealed the city's occupation sequence extending back to the 5th millennium BCE. His excavations documented the prosperity of the Third Dynasty period and the abrupt changes that followed its collapse. In 1930, Woolley's team was excavating residential quarters dating to the period immediately after the Third Dynasty's fall. The afternoon sun beat down on the exposed mud brick walls, heat radiating from surfaces that had been buried for 4,000 years. Dust hung in the still air, the smell of dry earth mixing with sweat from the Iraqi workers carefully brushing soil from fragile walls. Woolley stood at the edge of a freshly exposed room, roughly 3 meters square, its doorway opening onto what had been a street. The room's contents remained largely in place, preserved by the sudden abandonment. Clay vessels sat on shelves, a loom leaned against one wall, its wooden frame mostly decayed, but its weight still in position. Personal items scattered on the floor suggested the occupants had left quickly, taking only what they could carry. The team photographed everything in situ, then began carefully removing objects for conservation. Each item went into numbered bags, its position recorded on site plans. The room told a story of hasty departure, people fleeing their home with no intention of returning. Similar scenes appeared in dozens of other houses across the excavation area. By the season's end, Woolley had documented a pattern of rapid abandonment across entire residential districts. Households left suddenly, valuables sometimes remaining behind, suggesting crisis rather than planned relocation. The archaeological evidence from matches what the laments describe. Sudden collapse, massive population decline, abandonment of previously thriving neighborhoods, but it doesn't reveal cause. Cities can be abandoned for many reasons: military defeat, epidemic disease, economic collapse, environmental catastrophe. The physical remains alone don't distinguish between these possibilities. Uruk shows similar patterns. The city that had been Mesopotamia's largest urban center, home to perhaps 50,000 people at its peak, shrank dramatically. Entire districts were abandoned, buildings left to collapse, streets disappearing beneath wind-blown sand. The great temple complex of Iana, which had received continuous renovation and expansion for 2,000 years, ceased new construction. Excavations at Uruk reveal thick deposits of wind-blown sand and silt covering the abandonment layers. This suggests the city wasn't destroyed violently but simply emptied, people leaving and not returning, leaving buildings to gradual decay. Over decades the structures collapsed, mud brick returning to the earth from which it came. Nippur, the religious center that had remained neutral through centuries of political conflict, also shows evidence of disruption. The Temple of Enlil, which had received offerings from every Sumerian and Akkadian king, shows a gap in its occupation sequence, not permanent abandonment, but temporary cessation, perhaps lasting decades, before religious activities resumed on a reduced scale. Lagash and Umma, the rival cities whose conflicts had consumed resources for generations, both show destruction evidence. But here the archaeological record clearly indicates military violence. Walls breached, buildings burned, weapons and armor scattered in streets. These were cities conquered through conventional siege warfare, their destruction explicable through human conflict. The geographic pattern the archaeology reveals matches what the texts describe. Southern cities suffered more severely than northern ones. Cities along the Euphrates, particularly those southwest of Nippur, show the most dramatic evidence of abandonment and environmental change. Cities along the Tigris and in the northern plains show disruption but less severe collapse. Modern environmental analysis adds another layer of evidence. Soil cores from the region show sharp increases in salt content around 2000 BC. Pollen analysis indicates dramatic vegetation changes, agricultural species declining while desert plants increased. Climate reconstructions from ice cores and lake sediments show this period experienced significant drought across the Near East. The physical evidence paints a picture of civilization under multiple simultaneous stresses. Irrigation systems, already damaged by centuries of salinization, failed when centralized administration collapsed. Drought reduced rainfall below the minimum needed to sustain dry farming. Political fragmentation meant coordinated responses to crisis became impossible. Trade networks that had supplied cities with essential materials broke down. In this interpretation, the laments describe real disasters through religious framework. The evil wind was drought and famine. The mysterious deaths were epidemic disease spreading through weakened populations. The environmental damage was agricultural collapse producing cascading ecological failure. Divine warfare was the mythological language through which traumatized survivors made sense of catastrophes they couldn't otherwise explain. But questions remain. Why the geographic specificity of the evil wind, always from the west? Why the emphasis on sudden death without wounds? Why do the texts insist lands remained contaminated, dangerous to approach, long after violence ended? The archaeological evidence confirms catastrophe, but doesn't definitively explain it. The tablets describe weapons and effects that seem to exceed Bronze Age capabilities. Between textual description and physical remains lies interpretive space, where conventional and unconventional explanations compete. Among all the elements described in the lamentation texts, the evil wind receives the most detailed and consistent treatment. It appears in multiple independent compositions, always with similar characteristics, always moving in the same direction, always producing the same terrifying effects. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and describes it most comprehensively. The storm ordered by Enlil in hate, the storm which wears away the country, covered like a cloth, enveloped it like linen. On that day the storm forced all people to the earth. The storm annihilated the land, but then more specific details emerge. The wind came from the west. Every text that mentions direction specifies this. It moved eastward across Mesopotamia, affecting regions in a pattern that suggests actual geographic progression, rather than symbolic generality. Cities west and south of Nippur suffered most severely. Cities to the north and east experienced less damage. Death came mysteriously. In the city, the storm brought terror. No one dared go out in the street. It took hold of the fields. No one dared go out there either. People hid inside their houses, sealed the doors, but still they died. The texts emphasize repeatedly that conventional protection didn't help. Hiding indoors offered no safety. The victims showed no external wounds. Death by the storm carried off the living ones. No one saw weapons. No one saw blood. Yet the people lay dead in their houses, dead in the streets, dead in the fields. This detail appears so consistently across texts that it must reflect either observed reality or very specific shared mythology. Animals died alongside humans. The text catalogue this. Cattle, sheep, dogs, birds, fish in the rivers. The comprehensiveness suggests environmental catastrophe rather than selective human targeting. Whatever the evil wind was, it affected all life. Water and food became contaminated. The fresh water turned salty. The grain in the fields rotted. People who consumed food or water from affected areas became sick. The contamination persisted after the initial catastrophe, lands remaining dangerous for periods the texts measure in years. Bodies remained unburied. This detail is both specific and culturally significant. Mesopotamian religious practice demanded proper burial, the dead interred with provisions and prayers to ease their journey to the underworld. Yet the lament texts describe corpses left where they fell, people too afraid of contamination to approach them, bodies eventually consumed by scavengers or decaying in place. Conventional interpretations focus on disease as the most likely explanation. Epidemic illness spreading from invading armies could kill mysteriously without external wounds. Plague victims die internally, their suffering invisible to observers. Fear of contagion would prevent burial of victims. Water sources can be contaminated by corpses, spreading infection further. The Black Death of the 14th century CE killed roughly a third of Europe's population and produced similar responses: mysterious death, fear of contamination, bodies left unburied, flight from affected areas. Medieval chroniclers described it as divine punishment, pestilence sent from heaven, miasma poisoning the air. The parallels to Sumerian descriptions are striking. Climate catastrophe offers another conventional explanation. Severe drought combined with dust storms could produce wind that seemed to bring death. Dehydration kills without external wounds. Wind-blown dust-carrying spores or bacteria could contaminate water and food. The western directionality matches prevailing wind patterns in the region. Volcanic eruption, possibly from distant sources, could explain some details. Ash clouds kill through suffocation and toxic gas. Sulfur compounds poison water. Ashfall devastates agriculture. The Thera eruption around 1600 BCE affected civilizations hundreds of kilometers away, though that's too late to explain the Sumerian catastrophes. Alternative interpretations have proposed scenarios that sound like science fiction, but would match the textual descriptions precisely. Chemical weapons dispersed by wind, killing through inhalation, contaminating land and water, biological warfare targeting all life forms, radioactive fallout from nuclear detonations upwind, producing the mysterious deaths, contamination, and environmental damage the texts describe. These interpretations require accepting that such technologies existed in the ancient world, that the Anunnaki possessed capabilities far exceeding Bronze Age norms, that our understanding of cultural development is radically incomplete. Most scholars reject these premises as unsupported by evidence, yet the textual descriptions remain unsettlingly specific. If the evil wind was plague, why the consistent directionality? If drought, why the emphasis on sudden death rather than gradual starvation? If volcanic ash, why the geographic limitation rather than regional coverage? The mystery deepens when we consider that similar descriptions appear in other ancient texts. The Mahabharata describes weapons that produced wind carrying death, lands made barren for generations, contamination persisting long after battles ended. Biblical accounts mention fire from heaven destroying cities, lands becoming waste where nothing would grow. Perhaps these represent universal human responses to catastrophes we can't fully reconstruct. Perhaps they preserve memories of natural disasters, their details distorted through generations of transmission, but their essential truth intact. Or perhaps they describe something else, events that exceed our current frameworks for understanding ancient history. The tablets speak with remarkable consistency across time and authorship. Something happened around 2000 BCE that Sumerian civilization interpreted as divine warfare producing catastrophe through mysterious weapons. The archaeological evidence confirms the catastrophe, but leaves its cause ambiguous. What remains indisputable is that the war, whether between gods or nations or some combination thereof, left scars that shaped Mesopotamian history for 1,000 years. The cities affected never fully recovered. The political structures shattered. The environmental damage persisted across generations, and the memory endured, preserved in tablets, whose authors believed they were recording not myth but history, not symbol but testimony to events that ended an age. The tablets describe the divine conflict not as singular event, but as prolonged struggle between factions of the Anunnaki, rivalries that played out across generations and geography. Among the most significant was the contest between Marduk, patron god of Babylon, and Ninurta, champion of Nippur and the older Sumerian order. Marduk's rise threatened the established hierarchy. Babylon was a relatively minor city during the early dynastic period, subordinate to Nippur's religious authority and Ur's political dominance. But Babylonian ambitions grew, and with them came theological claims. Marduk, previously a second-tier deity, began to assert supremacy over the divine council, challenging Enlil's authority, and by extension Ninurta's role as divine warrior. The Enuma Elish, composed around 1800 BCE, but drawing on earlier traditions, frames this conflict cosmologically. Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the ordered cosmos, earning supremacy through martial prowess and creative power. Older deities, including those associated with Sumerian cities, acknowledge his kingship. It's theological propaganda, legitimating Babylon's political dominance through mythological narrative. But other texts suggest the conflict wasn't merely literary. The Era epic describes actual warfare between divine factions, battles fought not in mythological past but in historical time. Era, identified with Nergal but possibly representing Marduk's military aspect, brings destruction upon cities aligned with the older gods. Ninurta responds with his own weapons, particularly Shar-Ur, defending territories loyal to Nippur's authority. The geographic pattern of destruction around 2000 BCE might reflect this divine warfare playing out through human proxies. Cities traditionally allied with Nippur, the southern Sumerian centres like Ur and Uruk, suffered catastrophically. Babylon and northern cities experienced less damage. This distribution could indicate military conflict between north and south, Babylonian expansion crushing Sumerian resistance. In this reading, the laments describe actual war mythologized through religious language. The evil wind becomes Babylonian military might sweeping south. Divine weapons become the armies of competing city-states. The mysterious deaths become casualties of conventional siege warfare, starvation and disease. The gods didn't literally fight, but their earthly representatives did, and the theological framework made human conflict comprehensible as cosmic drama. This interpretation fits most evidence comfortably. Political conflict between Babylon and the southern cities is well documented. Babylon did rise to dominance during this period. The destruction of Sumerian power was real, whether accomplished through divine weapons or human armies, yet the weapon descriptions retain their troubling specificity. Shirur flies independently, Scouts returns to report. It's described across multiple texts spanning centuries with remarkable consistency. If purely symbolic, why maintain such detailed narrative coherence? The Emi that Marduk claims also receive concrete description, objects that grant power rather than abstract principles. The texts themselves insist on literal divine participation. These aren't stories about humans invoking God's names while fighting with bronze weapons. They describe Ninurta personally wielding Shirur, Marduk deploying the winds he'd captured, Nergal bringing plague and fire through direct action. The gods are presented as active combatants, not passive symbols. Perhaps we're reading the wrong layer of meaning. Maybe the texts operate simultaneously on multiple levels: historical conflicts between cities, theological contests between religious centres, and also preservation of actual events involving beings the Sumerians called gods. If the Anunnaki were something other than mythological constructs, if they possessed capabilities that seemed divine to Bronze Age observers, then human warfare and divine warfare might have been distinguishable in Sumerian experience. This requires premises most reject, but it's worth noting what the texts actually say versus what we interpret them to mean. They say gods fought with advanced weapons. We interpret this as humans fighting with conventional arms described through religious metaphor, but interpretation isn't translation, and our frameworks for reading ancient testimony might exclude possibilities the authors intended to preserve. The conflict between Marduk and Ninurta, whether divine or political or both, reshaped Mesopotamian civilization. Babylon's ascendancy marked the end of Sumerian cultural dominance. The southern cities never regained their former glory, political power shifted north permanently, and the memory of catastrophic warfare preserved in tablets describing divine combat became foundational to Mesopotamian consciousness for the next 2 millennia. The biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction bears striking similarities to Sumerian descriptions of cities destroyed in divine warfare. Both traditions describe sudden catastrophic annihilation, fire from heaven, lands made barren, contamination preventing habitation. The parallels have led some researchers to propose these stories preserve memory of the same events, catastrophes affecting the Near East around 2000 BCE. Genesis describes the destruction with specific details. Fire and sulfur rain from the sky. The cities are consumed completely. Lot's wife, looking back, transforms into a pillar of salt. The land becomes waste, producing nothing. Travelers avoid the region for generations. The Dead Sea area, traditionally identified as the city's location, shows evidence of destruction during this general period. Archaeological excavations around the Dead Sea have revealed several early Bronze Age cities that were suddenly abandoned around 2000 BCE. Babi Jarrah, Numera and other sites show destruction layers containing thick ash deposits. Evidence suggests the cities burned intensely, some buildings showing heat damage beyond what normal fire produces. The settlements were never reoccupied, remaining ruins until modern excavation. The Dead Sea region was accessible to Mesopotamian traders. Cuneiform tablets mention trade routes extending west to the cities of the plain, likely referring to settlements in the Jordan Valley and Dead Sea area. Materials from this region, particularly bitumen and salt, were valuable commodities in Mesopotamian commerce. Destruction of these trading partners would have affected Sumerian cities economically. Some texts from the period of the Sumerian catastrophes mention western regions suffering similar fates to the Mesopotamian cities. The geographic directionality of the evil wind, coming from the west, might indicate it affected areas west of Sumer, before moving eastward. If so, the Dead Sea cities and Mesopotamian cities could have been struck by the same phenomenon, whatever it was. Imagine a Sumerian merchant around 2100 BCE, preparing for a trading expedition westward. His name was Ur-Nammu, not the famous king, but a trader from Ur who shared the name. He'd made this journey a dozen times, following routes established over centuries, bringing copper and textiles west, returning with bitumen and aromatics. The caravan assembled outside Ur's walls at dawn, 20 donkeys loaded with trade goods, guards carrying bronze weapons, water carriers with filled skins for the desert crossing. Ur-Nammu performed the required offerings to Shamash, god of travellers, asking protection for the journey. The sun rose over the eastern horizon, its light catching the white plastered temple platforms, and the caravan moved west along the familiar route. 10 days later, they reached the Dead Sea trading posts, delivered their goods, received payment in bitumen blocks and precious resins, but something felt different this time. The Western traders spoke nervously about strange lights seen in the sky, about tremors felt in the night, about unease they couldn't name. Namu completed his business quickly and turned homeward earlier than planned, driven by instinct to leave. He never made that journey again. Within months, news reached that the western cities had been destroyed, consumed by fire, their sites avoided by travellers. The bitumen trade ended. Namu shifted to eastern routes, but the western disaster was prelude to greater catastrophes approaching Sumer itself. The connection between Dead Sea destructions and Mesopotamian catastrophes remains speculative. They occurred during the same general period, show similar destruction patterns, appear in related textual traditions. But correlation doesn't prove causation. Multiple independent disasters could have affected different regions through unrelated causes. Climate records show drought intensifying across the Near East around 2000 BCE. Rainfall declined, temperatures rose, agricultural productivity dropped. Societies under environmental stress become unstable, prone to conflict, vulnerable to disasters that stable societies might weather. The destructions in both regions might reflect civilization-wide crisis triggered by climate change. Alternatively, if the catastrophes shared a single cause, that cause would need to affect areas separated by hundreds of kilometers. Large-scale climate events could do this. Volcanic eruptions affecting the eastern Mediterranean would impact both regions. Asteroid impacts or airbursts could devastate wide areas. Epidemic disease follows trade routes, reaching distant cities. Or, in the interpretation some researchers propose, the similar descriptions reflect similar weapons deployed in coordinated campaign. If the Anunnaki warfare was literal rather than metaphorical, if it involved technology capable of destroying cities suddenly and completely, then strikes against multiple regions would be strategic. The Dead Sea cities and Mesopotamian cities served as nodes in interconnected networks. Destroying both would shatter trade, communication, political alliances. This interpretation requires accepting the ancient testimony more literally than most scholars find warranted. But it's worth noting that both Sumerian and Hebrew sources insist divine action caused these destructions, not human warfare or natural disaster. They describe weapons from heaven, contamination preventing return, environmental damage lasting generations. The biblical account adds one detail the Sumerian texts don't emphasize: righteous survivors warned in advance and fleeing before destruction. Abraham negotiating with divine messengers over Sodom's fate. Lot and his family escaping just before fire falls. This parallels the flood narrative's pattern. Righteous remnant preserved while the wicked perish. Whether the Sodom story and Sumerian laments describe the same events or parallel disasters, they share a narrative structure. Divine judgment executed through overwhelming force. Cities annihilated. Lands made barren. Survivors carrying memory forward. These patterns appear across ancient Near Eastern literature, suggesting either shared mythology or shared historical experience. The ruins around the Dead Sea still show evidence of their sudden end. The Mesopotamian cities still bear scars from their catastrophes, and the texts, Sumerian and Hebrew both, still describe destructions that seem to their authors to exceed human capacity, requiring divine explanation. The immediate destruction was only the beginning. The tablets describe long-term environmental damage that persisted for generations after the divine warfare ended, contamination that prevented reoccupation of affected regions, agricultural collapse that turned productive land into waste. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and states explicitly, the fields grew only weeds, even the marshes dried up, the fresh water turned salty. This wasn't temporary disruption but permanent transformation. Lands that had supported dense populations became unable to sustain even minimal agriculture. Modern archaeological surveys confirm this pattern. Settlement patterns shifted dramatically after 2000 BCE. Regions that had been densely occupied showed near-total abandonment. New settlements appeared in previously marginal areas, while formerly productive zones remained empty. This distribution persisted for centuries, suggesting the land itself had changed, not merely political circumstances. Soil analysis reveals what happened. Salt content in agricultural soils spiked dramatically during this period. The intensive irrigation that had made Mesopotamian civilization possible had always carried risks. In arid climates, constant watering raises water tables, bringing dissolved salts from deep layers to the surface. Evaporation concentrates these salts in the root zone, eventually reaching levels toxic to crops. This process, called salinization, was recognized by Sumerian agronomists. Cuneiform tablets from earlier periods describe shifting from wheat to more salt-tolerant barley, reducing planting density to allow soil recovery, fallowing fields for extended periods. These were attempts to manage an environmental problem created by agriculture itself, but around 2000 BCE the process accelerated catastrophically. Salt levels that had been gradually rising suddenly spiked. Agricultural productivity collapsed. Fields that should have supported recovery instead became increasingly barren. The conventional explanation is that political chaos disrupted irrigation maintenance, allowing canals to silt up, drainage to fail, water tables to rise unchecked. Yet some researchers note the scale and speed seem excessive for simple maintenance failure. Irrigation systems had been disrupted before, during political upheavals, yet recovery occurred within decades. This time the damage persisted for centuries. Some regions never recovered, remaining marginal or entirely abandoned to the present day. The tablets attribute this to divine curse. Enlil decreed that the land would rebel, that it would refuse to produce, that even efforts to restore it would fail. Modern environmental science describes the same phenomenon through different vocabulary. Catastrophic salinization, soil chemistry transformed beyond recovery through available remediation techniques. River courses changed during this period. The Euphrates shifted its channel, abandoning cities that had relied on it for water and transport. Some of these shifts resulted from natural processes. Rivers in flat terrain naturally migrate over time, but the concentration of channel changes around 2000 BCE suggests something triggered accelerated movement. Earthquakes can force river course changes. The region sits near tectonic boundaries, where the Arabian and Eurasian plates meet. Seismic activity occurs regularly, occasionally producing significant quakes. A major earthquake during this period could have triggered both river channel changes and irrigation system collapse. The texts mention earth shaking during the catastrophes. The ground trembled like a reed platform. The foundations of the land shook. This could describe seismic activity, either from natural tectonic processes or, as some alternative interpretations suggest, from whatever weapons the divine warfare employed. Water sources becoming contaminated receives repeated emphasis. The texts describe water turning salty, rivers running with bitter streams, wells becoming undrinkable. This could result from saltwater intrusion as irrigation systems failed and water tables dropped, allowing saline groundwater to contaminate formerly fresh sources. Or it could describe chemical contamination from some source the texts don't specify. Military theorists studying ancient warfare have noted that poisoning water supplies was a known tactic. Various substances available in the ancient world could render water temporarily undrinkable, but contamination persisting for years or generations requires something beyond conventional toxins. The long-term environmental damage matches what the texts describe, but exceeds what we'd expect from Bronze Age warfare or even major natural disasters. Cities can be rebuilt, fields can be replanted, rivers can be rechanneled, yet the regions affected around 2000 BCE remained marginal for centuries. This persistence has led some researchers to propose extraordinary explanations. If the divine weapons were nuclear, radioactive contamination would persist for generations, affecting soil chemistry, water sources, the ability of land to support life. If chemical weapons were deployed, certain compounds could bind to soil particles, remaining toxic for extended periods. These interpretations require accepting technological capabilities far beyond what mainstream scholarship attributes to the Bronze Age. They demand evidence that hasn't been found, radiation signatures in soil samples, chemical residues that couldn't result from natural processes, artifacts demonstrating advanced metallurgy or physics. What remains undeniable is that environmental catastrophe did occur, that it exceeded the scale of previous disasters, that recovery took longer than conventional explanations easily account for. Whether the cause was natural, human, or something else, the land bore wounds that shaped Mesopotamian history for a millennium. The tablets speak of cursed ground, of divine decree making Earth rebel against human habitation. Modern science describes cascading environmental failure, systems stressed beyond recovery thresholds. The language differs, but the observation remains. Something poisoned the land, and it stayed poisoned long after the violence ended. Among all the controversial interpretations of the Sumerian catastrophe texts, none generates more debate than suggestions that the descriptions preserve evidence of nuclear warfare. This interpretation, popularized in the late 20th century, points to textual details that supposedly match effects of atomic weapons. Brilliant light, devastating heat, mysterious death, long-term contamination. The case rests primarily on parallels between ancient descriptions and modern nuclear effects. The brilliance associated with divine weapons matches the intense light of nuclear detonation. The heat that consumed cities corresponds to the thermal pulse. The evil wind bringing death without wounds resembles radiation sickness. The long-term contamination matches radioactive fallout, Physical evidence has been cited to support this interpretation. Tektites, small glassy objects formed from sand melted at extreme temperatures, have been found in desert regions of the Near East. Some researchers propose these result from nuclear explosions melting silica. Mainstream geology attributes them to meteor impacts or lightning strikes, natural processes producing the required heat. Skeletons found at Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, roughly contemporary with the Sumerian catastrophes, show evidence of sudden death and unusual heat exposure. Some researchers have claimed radiation signatures in bone samples. Most archaeologists attribute the findings to conventional causes: fire from urban conflagration, bodies exposed to heat from burning buildings. No unambiguous evidence of nuclear processes has been found in Mesopotamian sites from this period. Radiation signatures that couldn't result from natural isotope decay haven't been detected. Materials showing transmutation from neutron exposure haven't appeared. Artifacts demonstrating knowledge of nuclear physics don't exist. The scientific consensus firmly rejects nuclear warfare as explanation for the Sumerian catastrophes. The technology required is too complex, too dependent on industrial infrastructure, too far beyond anything the archaeological record supports. Bronze Age peoples lacked the metallurgy, chemistry and physics necessary even to conceive of nuclear weapons, much less construct them. Yet the question persists, because the textual descriptions remain troubling. If we dismiss nuclear interpretation, we must explain what the texts are actually describing. Conventional weapons don't produce brilliant light visible for great distances. Normal fire doesn't generate heat that consumes stone. Plague kills through visible illness, not mysteriously as the texts insist. Perhaps we're too literal in reading ancient testimony. Poetic language amplifies, metaphor transforms, religious framework interprets. A major fire could be described as brilliance like the sun. Disease could be death without visible wounds, if internal symptoms weren't observed or understood. Environmental damage from any cause could be land cursed by gods. Or perhaps the phenomena described were real but resulted from natural rather than technological causes. Meteor airbursts can produce intense light, devastating blast waves, heat sufficient to melt sand. Large meteors exploding in atmosphere would be interpreted as divine weapons, brilliance from heaven destroying cities below. The Tunguska event of 1908 provides modern comparison. A meteor or comet fragment exploded over Siberia with force equivalent to 10-15 megatons of TNT. The blast flattened trees across 2,000 square kilometers. Witnesses reported brilliant light. Heat felt 60 kilometers away. Atmospheric effects lasting days. Had this occurred over populated area, the destruction would have been catastrophic. The testimony would have seemed supernatural. A similar airburst over Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE would produce effects matching textual descriptions. Brilliant light visible across the region, blast wave destroying cities, heat igniting fires, atmospheric disturbance creating strange winds, debris falling from sky, long-term environmental damage from impact effects. This explanation is speculative, but scientifically plausible. Meteor impacts and airbursts occur regularly on geological timescales. One striking during this period falls well within probability. The effects would match ancient descriptions without requiring advanced technology, yet it doesn't fully satisfy. The geographic pattern of destruction suggests directionality, intentionality, targeting specific cities while sparing others. Natural catastrophes don't discriminate that precisely. The texts insist on divine warfare, intentional deployment of weapons against chosen targets, not random cosmic accident. We circle back to the fundamental interpretive question. Do we read these texts as accurate testimony, described in available vocabulary, or as mythological transformation of events into religious narrative? If the former, we must account for capabilities that seem impossible. If the latter, we must explain why the impossible capabilities receive such consistent, specific, cross-cultural description. The radiation interpretation remains fringe, rejected by mainstream scholarship for lack of physical evidence and implausibility of technological achievement. But it persists because the alternative explanations, while more conservative, also struggle to account for all details the texts preserve. What remains certain is that something extraordinary happened, something that impressed ancient witnesses deeply enough to shape religious understanding for millennia. Whether nuclear fire, meteor impact, or catastrophes we haven't yet imagined, the mystery endures in tablets that still speak of brilliance, that consumed cities and winds that brought death from the sky. Hidden within the chronology of the Sumerian catastrophes lies an astronomical dimension that some researchers believe holds keys to understanding what actually occurred. The tablets don't merely describe earthly destruction, but repeatedly reference celestial phenomena coinciding with the disasters. Unusual brightness in the sky, stars behaving strangely, cosmic disturbances accompanying divine warfare. The lamentation texts mention the heavens changing. The stars did not move in their proper courses. The moon stood still in strange positions. The sun's brightness dimmed. These descriptions could be poetic expressions of cosmic disorder, mirroring earthly chaos, or they might preserve observations of actual astronomical events that ancient witnesses struggled to explain. Astronomical records from Mesopotamia during this period are frustratingly sparse. The systematic observation programs that would produce detailed planetary tablets came later, emerging after the catastrophes during Babylonian ascendancy. But scattered references in administrative texts and omen collections suggest unusual celestial activity was noted and considered significant. Comet appearances were always interpreted as omens, divine messages warning of change or disaster. Several texts from around 2000 BCE mention hairy stars, or stars with tails, the standard descriptions for comets. One tablet fragment states, "When a star pulls a tail of fire across the sky, cities will be destroyed and kings will fall." Whether this describes observation or prophecy remains ambiguous. Modern astronomical reconstruction can identify significant celestial events that occurred during this period. Several bright comets passed through the inner solar system between 2200 and 1900 BCE, visible from Mesopotamia, their appearances correlating loosely with the chronology of disasters described in texts. Correlation isn't causation, but the timing invites consideration. Meteor showers intensify periodically as Earth passes through debris fields left by comets. Enhanced meteor activity would be interpreted as the sky itself attacking the Earth, fire falling from heaven, divine weapons deployed from celestial realm. The Perseids, Leonids, and other annual showers occasionally produce meteor storms with thousands of visible meteors per hour, creating spectacular displays ancient observers would surely record. More significantly, several researchers have proposed that a large meteor or comet fragment might have impacted or exploded over the Near East during this period. The Tunguska event demonstrates that such occurrences produce effects easily mistaken for divine weapons. Brilliant light, devastating blast, atmospheric disturbance, long-lasting environmental damage. Evidence for impact events comes from multiple sources. Ice core samples from Greenland show platinum anomalies around 2000 BCE, elevated levels of this element that can indicate extraterrestrial material entering atmosphere. Pollen records show sudden vegetation changes suggesting environmental disruption. Tree ring data indicates growth disruptions consistent with atmospheric cooling from dust or ash. The geographic pattern of destruction, concentrated in specific regions while sparing others, doesn't match global catastrophe, but could reflect airburst over Mesopotamia, with blast effects radiating outward. Cities closer to ground zero suffered more severely. Those farther away experienced lesser damage. The evil wind could be atmospheric shockwave propagating from explosion site, carrying heat and debris. This interpretation remains speculative. No confirmed impact crater from this period has been found in or near Mesopotamia, though craters can be difficult to identify in alluvial plains where sediment quickly buries evidence. Ocean impacts leave even less trace unless very large. An airburst like Tunguska leaves no crater at all, evidence limited to blast effects and scattered meteoritic material. The celestial timing adds another dimension. Some alternative researchers note that the period around 2000 BCE falls near transitions in precessional ages, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts which constellation appears at spring equinox. The transition from Taurus to Aries occurred during this period, and subsequent transition from Aries to Pisces coincided with other major civilizational changes. Whether these precessional transitions have any actual effect on terrestrial events is hotly debated. Mainstream astronomy finds no physical mechanism by which stellar background positions could influence earthly affairs. Alternative perspectives propose subtle gravitational or electromagnetic effects, or suggest the transitions mark cycles recognized by ancient astronomical observers who anticipated associated changes. The tablets themselves link celestial and earthly events directly. When gods war in heaven, Earth suffers consequences. This could be metaphorical, cosmic disorder reflecting social chaos, or it could be observational, ancient witnesses noting that unusual sky phenomena coincided with terrestrial catastrophes, drawing the reasonable conclusion that they were connected. Perhaps the astronomical dimension helps explain why the Sumerians framed their catastrophes as divine warfare rather than natural disaster. If brilliant lights appeared in the sky, if meteors fell in unusual numbers, if comets blazed overhead just before cities were destroyed, the divine warfare interpretation makes perfect sense. The gods are the celestial bodies. Their movements and interactions govern earthly fate. Their conflicts play out in both cosmic and terrestrial realms simultaneously. Modern astronomy, divorced from astrology and divination, struggles to take these connections seriously. Yet ancient observers watch the sky with attention we've lost, tracking patterns across generations, noting correlations we might miss. If they insisted celestial events accompanied earthly catastrophes, perhaps we should consider their testimony more carefully. The silence of the archaeological record regarding specific astronomical events frustrates investigation. We have the texts describing celestial disturbances. We have evidence of earthly catastrophes. We have astronomical reconstructions showing significant celestial events occurred during this period. What we lack is definitive proof connecting them, the smoking gun that would confirm the ancient witnesses accurately recorded causal relationships. The mystery remains suspended between heaven and earth, cosmic events and terrestrial disasters, divine warfare and natural catastrophe, all somehow entangled in ways we haven't fully unraveled, despite a century of investigation. Beneath the mythological language describing divine weapons lies a level of technical detail that continues to puzzle researchers. The consistency across texts, the specific capabilities attributed to each weapon, the observable effects they supposedly produced, all these suggest either remarkably sophisticated literary tradition or descriptions of actual objects whose nature we haven't properly understood. Sharur, Ninurta's weapon, receives the most detailed treatment. The name means smasher of thousands, which sounds like typical military hyperbole, but the texts don't describe Sharur as merely powerful, but as possessing capabilities that seem to exceed Bronze Age technology. It flies independently, without being thrown or launched. It scouts enemy territory and returns to report what it observed. It communicates with Ninurta, engaging in dialogue about tactics and strategy. The Lugalay, a Sumerian epic describing Ninurta's military campaigns, presents Sharur as having intelligence and autonomy. It advises Ninurta on battle strategy, warns of dangers, even expresses opinions about which enemies to attack. When deployed, it flies to targets, strikes with devastating force, and returns to its master's hand. The text describes its flight path, its impact effects, its return trajectory, with the precision of technical documentation. Mainstream scholarship interprets Sharur symbolically. The weapon represents Ninurta's military power, personified for narrative purposes. Ancient literature routinely personifies objects, giving voice to weapons, tools, even geographical features. The technical details are embellishment, creative elaboration, making the story more engaging. Yet the embellishment is oddly specific and remarkably consistent. Sharur appears in multiple texts spanning centuries, always with the same characteristics, always described in similar terms. If purely literary device, why maintain such rigid consistency? Fiction usually varies more than this across different authors and periods. Alternative interpretations propose that Sharur might have been an actual device, perhaps some form of projectile or surveillance tool that Sumerian language struggled to describe. A sophisticated thrown weapon might seem to fly and return. A messenger bird trained for reconnaissance could scout and report. The text could be preserving memory of something real, translated into vocabulary available to Bronze Age scribes. The more radical interpretation suggests Sharur was technology far beyond Bronze Age norms, some form of guided projectile or aerial vehicle that the Anunnaki possessed but humans couldn't replicate. If the divine warfare was literal rather than metaphorical, if it involved capabilities exceeding human achievement, then accurate description of those capabilities would sound exactly like the texts we have. This requires accepting premises about the Anunnaki that most scholars reject, but it's worth noting what would be required to fake such descriptions. Ancient authors would need to imagine technologies they had no framework for conceiving, maintain consistent technical specifications across centuries and cultures, and embed these imaginary technologies so thoroughly into historical narratives that they become inseparable from documented events. The 7 weapons of Era received similar treatment. Each had specific effects precisely described. One made heaps of the corpses of warriors, another destroyed walls, a third dried up water sources, a fourth made fire blaze in cities. These weren't generic destruction but targeted effects, each weapon suited to particular purposes. Modern military technology employs exactly this principle. Different weapons for different targets. Bunker busters for fortifications, incendiaries for area effects, thermobaric weapons for enclosed spaces. The 7 sound like a weapons system designed for comprehensive assault, each component addressing specific tactical requirements. Perhaps this reflects Bronze Age military thinking more sophisticated than we credit. Different tactics for different targets existed. Battering rams for walls, fire arrows for buildings, poisoning for water sources. The text could be describing conventional military capabilities, organized systematically, and attributed to divine weapons to enhance their prestige, or perhaps the descriptions are more literal. If the divine warfare involved technology we'd recognize as advanced weapons systems, ancient observers would describe them in available vocabulary. Flying objects become birds or arrows or divine weapons. Explosions become thunderbolts. Guidance systems become divine intelligence directing the weapon's path. The evil wind remains the most troubling weapon described. It killed without visible wounds, affected all life forms, moved in definable geographic patterns, left contamination persisting for years. Modern weapons technology includes nothing quite matching this description, except radiation, chemical agents, or biological weapons, all requiring industrial chemistry or nuclear physics. Some researchers have proposed that ancient knowledge of chemistry exceeded what we attribute to Bronze Age cultures. Arsenic, mercury, lead, various plant and fungal toxins were known and used. Perhaps sophisticated deployment of such substances could produce effects the texts describe, but the scale and persistence still seem to exceed what conventional toxins could accomplish. The weapons descriptions preserve details that resist both comfortable mythological interpretation and easy technological explanation. They're too specific to dismiss as pure fiction, too advanced to accept as Bronze Age achievement, too consistent to attribute to coincidental similar embellishments across independent texts. Hidden within these accounts might be actual knowledge of capabilities we haven't properly recognized. Whether those capabilities were conventional weapons described poetically, natural phenomena misunderstood as weapons, or technologies that actually exceeded Bronze Age norms, remains one of the most contentious questions in ancient Near Eastern studies. The tablets offer no simple resolution. They describe weapons that flew, that killed mysteriously, that produced effects persisting long after use. Whatever these weapons actually were, they impressed ancient witnesses deeply enough to shape how divine warfare was imagined and described for millennia. When archaeologists excavate destruction layers from around 2000 BCE at Mesopotamian sites, they find evidence that confirms catastrophe but complicates simple explanations. The physical remains speak, but like the tablets, they allow multiple readings. Thick ash deposits characterize many destruction layers from this period. Aru Nippur all show evidence of extensive burning. The ash isn't thin scatter from cooking fires or limited conflagration, but deep deposits indicating major fires consuming large portions of the cities. Chemical analysis reveals temperatures exceeding normal structure fires, heat sufficient to vitrify mud brick, melting the silica within clay into glassy substances. This level of heat is unusual but not impossible from conventional causes. Buildings packed closely together, wooden roof beams and furnishings, stored grain and oil, all these provide fuel for intense fires. Once started, urban conflagrations can generate extreme temperatures through sustained burning of concentrated combustible materials, yet some findings puzzle conventional interpretation. Stone surfaces showing signs of melting or extreme heat exposure appear in context suggesting they weren't in burning buildings, but exposed in open areas. Pottery shards fused together as if exposed to sudden intense heat. These details could reflect fire conditions we don't fully understand, or they could indicate heat sources beyond conventional combustion. The destruction layers also contain human remains in context suggesting sudden death. Skeletons found in positions indicating people died while engaged in ordinary activities, cooking, working, sitting. The conventional interpretation is that deaths occurred during assault, people killed by invading forces before they could flee, but some researchers note the absence of defensive wounds, the apparent lack of trauma that would indicate violent death in combat. Mass burial pits from this period contain hundreds of bodies interred hastily, sometimes without proper ritual treatment. This could indicate epidemic disease overwhelming normal burial practices, so many dead that proper ceremonies became impossible, or it could reflect fear of contamination, bodies disposed of quickly to prevent spread of whatever killed them. Beneath the visible destruction layers, deeper excavations sometimes reveal earlier phases showing similar patterns. Mesopotamian cities were destroyed and rebuilt repeatedly across their long histories. The catastrophes around 2000 BCE weren't unique, just particularly severe and widespread. This cyclical pattern of collapse and renewal shaped the region's archaeological sequence for millennia. Modern geological analysis adds layers of data ancient texts couldn't capture. Soil samples from destruction layers can be dated precisely through radiocarbon analysis, confirming the chronology suggested by tablets. Chemical signatures can identify sources of materials, tracing trade networks even after they collapsed. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains reveals dietary information, showing how nutrition changed before and after catastrophes. Seismic evidence indicates the region experienced major earthquakes during this period. Ground displacement visible in excavation profiles shows structures tilted or offset by earth movement. Earthquake damage alone could account for much destruction, triggering fires, collapsing irrigation systems, disrupting social organization sufficiently to produce the cascading failures texts describe. Climate data reconstructed from multiple sources paints a picture of severe drought. Lake levels dropped dramatically, river flows diminished, pollen records show vegetation shifting toward more drought-resistant species. Agricultural capacity would have declined sharply, producing famine, social stress, political instability, all contributing to civilizational collapse. The physical evidence supports a scenario of multiple simultaneous stresses: earthquake damage, climate crisis, political fragmentation, possibly epidemic disease, all amplifying each other's effects. This scenario requires no extraordinary explanations, no advanced weapons, no divine intervention. Natural and human factors combining catastrophically suffice to explain most observations, yet certain details remain uncomfortable. The geographic specificity of damage doesn't match natural disaster patterns perfectly. Earthquakes affect regions based on geology, not political boundaries, yet the destruction followed patterns that seem to respect city affiliations. The evil wind's directionality, always from the west, doesn't match typical weather patterns or seismic effects. The persistence of environmental damage exceeds what earthquake and drought alone would produce. Land can recover from seismic disruption within years. Even severe droughts' effects diminish once rainfall returns, but the regions affected around 2000 BCE remained marginal for centuries, suggesting damage to the land itself rather than merely disruption of systems maintaining it. Hidden beneath the destruction layers might be evidence we haven't properly recognized. Excavation techniques have improved dramatically since early digs. Chemical analysis methods unavailable to pioneers like Woolley could reveal signatures we missed. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies continue finding features traditional excavation overlooked. Perhaps future investigations will clarify mysteries current evidence leaves ambiguous. Or perhaps the ambiguity is inherent, the past refusing to yield simple answers to complex questions. The archaeological record, like the tablets, speaks but doesn't explain, preserving evidence while leaving interpretation to those who study it. What lies beneath the destruction layers is both less and more than we imagine. Mundane evidence of catastrophe, explicable through conventional means, yet arranged in patterns that hint at stories we haven't fully grasped. The earth keeps its secrets patiently, revealing them slowly to those willing to dig with care and read with humility. After examining the texts and the archaeological evidence, we're left with the fundamental question that has divided researchers for over a century. What actually happened in Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE? The answer depends on how we weigh competing evidence, what premises we accept, and how we interpret ancient testimony. The mainstream scholarly view attributes the catastrophes to natural causes, amplified by human factors, or mythologized through religious frameworks. Climate change stressed agricultural systems already damaged by centuries of salinization. Drought reduced crop yields below subsistence levels. Political fragmentation prevented coordinated responses. Invading populations from mountains and deserts added military pressure. Cities fell through siege warfare. Epidemic disease spread through weakened populations. The environmental and social collapse was real and devastating, but explicable through conventional historical processes. This interpretation fits comfortably within our understanding of how civilizations fail. Bronze Age societies were vulnerable to climate fluctuations, dependent on irrigation systems requiring constant maintenance, politically unstable due to competing city-states. When multiple stresses coincided, collapse became inevitable. The Sumerian catastrophes follow patterns observed in other ancient collapses. Mycenaean Greece, Indus Valley, classic Maya, all show similar trajectories of environmental stress, leading to political fragmentation and civilizational collapse. The religious language describing divine warfare is, in this view, how traumatized survivors made sense of overwhelming disaster. Attributing catastrophe to divine conflict provided meaning, located suffering within cosmic drama, rather than meaningless chaos. The weapon descriptions are poetic elaborations of conventional military force. The evil wind was drought and famine personified. The long-term damage was agricultural collapse mythologized as divine curse. Some scholars working within this framework focus specifically on climate as the primary driver. Drought intensified across the Near East around 2200 BCE, triggering what's called the 4.2 kiloyear event, a rapid climate shift producing aridification that lasted centuries. This drought correlates precisely with collapse of multiple Bronze Age civilizations: Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, Old Kingdom in Egypt, early Bronze Age cultures in the Levant, Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley. The synchronicity suggests shared environmental cause rather than coincidental separate disasters. Others emphasize human warfare and political collapse. The Gutian invasions did occur, documented in multiple sources, Conflicts between cities intensified as resources diminished. The destruction layers show evidence of military violence, walls breached, buildings burned, weapons scattered in streets. Perhaps the divine warfare texts preserve memory of these human conflicts, elevated to cosmic scale through mythological interpretation. Alternative interpretations question whether conventional explanations fully account for the textual and archaeological evidence. They note the specificity of weapon descriptions that seem to exceed Bronze Age capabilities. They point to the geographic patterns of destruction that don't perfectly match natural disaster distributions. They emphasize the environmental damage that persisted longer than drought and warfare typically produce. The Ahemerist perspective proposes that the Anunnaki were human rulers, or perhaps representatives of more advanced civilization, whose capabilities seem divine to Bronze Age Sumerians. If knowledge and technology existed that exceeded Mesopotamian norms, whether from earlier civilizations or distant regions, its deployment in conflict would be described in the vocabulary available: divine beings wielding weapons from heaven. This interpretation requires accepting that human development wasn't uniformly progressive, that knowledge could be lost and found, that capabilities we associate with later periods might have existed earlier in limited contexts. Some researchers point to anomalies in the archaeological record, artifacts showing sophistication beyond expected levels, to support this possibility. Others reject it as unsupported speculation based on selective reading of ambiguous evidence. The catastrophist view focuses on natural events of unusual severity. Perhaps a large meteor impact or airburst occurred over or near Mesopotamia, producing effects matching textual descriptions: brilliant light, devastating blast, atmospheric disturbance, environmental damage. The Tunguska event demonstrates such occurrences are possible, and their rarity means we might not recognize evidence properly. Ice core anomalies and tree ring disruptions from this period hint at atmospheric disturbance that could reflect extraterrestrial impact. A few researchers continue to propose that the descriptions preserve memory of advanced technological warfare, whether attributing it to ancient astronauts, lost civilizations, or other scenarios requiring capabilities far beyond Bronze Age norms. These interpretations remain firmly outside mainstream scholarship, rejected for lack of physical evidence and implausibility of proposed technologies, yet they persist because the textual descriptions, taken literally, seem to require extraordinary explanations. We may never know with certainty which interpretation comes closest to historical reality. The evidence allows multiple readings. The text can be understood as myth, or as distorted memory, or as accurate testimony, described in limited vocabulary. The archaeological remains confirm catastrophe, but don't definitively prove cause. Perhaps the truth involves elements from multiple interpretations. Natural disasters created conditions for human conflicts that were mythologized through religious frameworks, with each layer adding distortion while preserving some core of actual events. Maybe climate stress triggered wars that were interpreted as divine conflicts, with the environmental damage resulting from both natural and human causes. Or perhaps we're missing something fundamental, asking the wrong questions, because our frameworks exclude possibilities the evidence actually suggests. Ancient peoples might have experienced realities we don't have categories for, witnessed events we can't reconstruct from partial remains, understood connections between cosmic and earthly phenomena that our materialist worldview dismisses. The humility to acknowledge uncertainty serves us better than premature certainty. The Sumerian catastrophes remain genuinely mysterious, resistant to simple explanation despite a century of investigation. That mystery itself has value, keeping us engaged with questions about how we understand ancient testimony, how we interpret ambiguous evidence, how we balance skepticism and openness when facing the unfamiliar. The tablets still speak across 4 millennia. Whether they preserve history, theology, or something between these categories, they invite us into profound questions about catastrophe, memory, and the relationship between human experience and cosmic forces. The Sumerian accounts of catastrophic divine warfare don't stand alone. Similar narratives appear across ancient civilizations, describing destructions that exceeded normal human warfare, weapons that seem to come from heaven, environmental damage persisting for generations. Whether these parallels indicate universal mythological patterns, shared historical experiences, or something else entirely, remains one of ancient study's most intriguing questions. The Mahabharata, India's great epic, describes wars involving weapons of devastating power. The Brahmastra could destroy entire armies, producing brilliance brighter than 10,000 suns, leaving lands barren where even birds did not fly. Descriptions include heat that consumed everything, winds that brought death, contamination that required ritual purification before approaching affected areas. The parallels to Sumerian evil wind accounts are striking. Mainstream Indology interprets these weapons as mythological exaggerations of conventional arms, poetic language elevating human conflict to cosmic scale. The Mahabharata was composed over centuries, achieving final form around 400 CE, though incorporating much older material. Its weapon descriptions could reflect literary elaboration, each retelling amplifying destructive capabilities until they reach supernatural levels. Yet some researchers note that the technical details remain consistent across versions, describing effects that sound remarkably like modern nuclear, chemical, or radiological weapons. The similarity to Sumerian descriptions, arising in completely independent literary traditions separated by thousands of kilometers, suggests either universal human imagination converging on similar fantastical weapons, or preservation of memories of actual events witnessed by different cultures. Greek mythology features the Anunnaki, the war between Olympian gods and older titans that shaped the cosmos. Zeus wielded thunderbolts that shattered mountains. Typhon's defeat scorched the earth, creating deserts. The conflict left permanent marks on landscape and established the cosmic order that would govern subsequent ages. These accounts parallel Mesopotamian divine warfare in structure and consequence. Egyptian texts mention Seth's conflict with Osiris and Horus, battles involving divine weapons that affected earthly realm. Later Egyptian sources describe celestial fire, destroying cities, plagues sent from heaven, lands made barren through divine curse. The synchronicity with Mesopotamian catastrophes, occurring during Egypt's first intermediate period, when centralized authority collapsed, suggests shared chronology of crisis affecting the entire Near East. Native American traditions across multiple cultures describe sky battles, conflicts among celestial beings that produced earthly catastrophes. The Hopi speak of worlds destroyed by fire from above. Plains traditions mention Star Wars visible in night sky preceding great changes. Pacific Northwest peoples describe times when sky fell and lands were transformed. These traditions, dismissed as mere mythology, might preserve distant memories of actual astronomical events witnessed globally. The biblical account of the Tower of Babel describes humanity's unity being shattered, languages confused, peoples scattered across Earth. This narrative parallels the fragmentation of Mesopotamian civilization around 2000 BCE, when unified political structures broke apart, populations migrated, cultural coherence dissolved. Perhaps the story preserves memory of this collapse, interpreting civilizational fragmentation through theological narrative. Flood narratives appear across cultures worldwide, describing catastrophic inundations that destroyed previous civilizations. While most scholars attribute this to universal human experience with flooding and its obvious destructive power, the similarities in detail, timing, and consequence suggested by various traditions have led some researchers to propose actual global or near-global catastrophe around 3000–2000 BCE. The question these parallel traditions raise is whether they represent convergent mythology or divergent memory. Human imagination might naturally create similar stories about divine warfare, cosmic conflicts, civilization-ending catastrophes. These are archetypal themes addressing universal anxieties about destruction, divine power, humanity's fragility. Similar stories arising independently would demonstrate shared psychological patterns rather than shared historical experiences. Or perhaps the traditions preserve distorted but genuine memories of events affecting multiple regions. Climate catastrophes around 2200 BCE did impact civilizations across the Old World. Volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, or other natural disasters visible from multiple locations would be recorded in various cultural frameworks. The similarities might reflect different peoples witnessing and remembering the same phenomena, each through their particular religious and linguistic lenses. The most radical interpretation proposes that these traditions describe actual global conflicts involving technologies exceeding what we attribute to Bronze Age cultures. If advanced civilizations existed and fell, if knowledge was lost and partially preserved in mythology, then similar stories across cultures might be fragments of actual history mythologized over millennia. This interpretation requires accepting premises most scholars reject, yet it's worth noting what would be necessary to fabricate such consistency. Independent cultures imagining similar impossible technologies, maintaining similar technical details across generations, all coincidentally describing events in the same rough chronological period. We may never definitively determine whether these parallel traditions reflect shared mythology, shared catastrophic experiences, or something more complex. The patterns exist, confirmed by textual analysis across cultures. Their meaning remains interpretively open, dependent on premises about human psychology, cultural transmission, and what kinds of events leave what kinds of memories. Perhaps the value lies not in resolving the question, but in recognizing its depth, Ancient peoples across the world told stories about catastrophic conflicts that damaged the earth itself, about weapons from heaven, about ages ending in fire and wind. Whether these stories preserve history or create mythology or accomplish both simultaneously, they demonstrate that our ancestors grappled with questions about destruction, divine power, and humanity's relationship to forces beyond control. The mystery connects us to them across millennia. Their questions become our questions. Their uncertainty mirrors ours, and in that continuity of wondering, we find ourselves part of an ancient conversation that shows no signs of ending, new evidence constantly emerging while definitive answers remain elusive. The tablets from Sumer, the epics from India, the myths from Greece and Egypt, and the Americas all speak in different languages about themes that transcend culture and time. Whether they speak truth or fiction, or some complex mixture, they speak still, inviting engagement with mysteries that have survived 4,000 years of scrutiny without yielding simple explanations. The memory of the catastrophes survived the collapse they described, preserved through multiple channels across millennia. The tablets themselves, baked hard by fires that destroyed the libraries housing them, lay buried beneath ruins for 2,000 years. But the stories didn't die with Sumerian civilization. They were too important, too deeply embedded in Mesopotamian consciousness, to simply vanish when cities fell and languages changed. The Akkadians, who politically dominated Mesopotamia after Sumer's fall, adopted the narratives wholesale, translating lamentation texts into their own language while maintaining essential content. The Babylonians continued this transmission, copying ancient tablets, preserving traditions in temple schools where scribes learned to read cuneiform alongside contemporary administrative skills. Even as political power shifted, as empires rose and fell, the scribal tradition maintained continuity across generations. The catastrophe narratives became foundational to Mesopotamian religious consciousness. Annual festivals commemorated the destructions, ritual lamentations recited the ancient texts, processions reenacted the cosmic battles. This wasn't mere historical memory, but active religious practice, keeping the past present through liturgical repetition. The wars of the gods remained living theology, not dead history. Biblical tradition absorbed these stories through cultural contact and shared geography. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah parallels Sumerian city destructions. The Tower of Babel narrative reflects Mesopotamian political fragmentation. Prophetic literature employs imagery derived from lamentation texts. Cities made desolate, lands cursed, divine warfare producing earthly catastrophe. The Hebrew scriptures, while transforming these themes through monotheistic framework, preserved core patterns recognizable from Sumerian sources. Greek historians visiting Mesopotamia encountered these traditions through Persian intermediaries. Herodotus mentions Babylon's ancient destructions. Berossus, the Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BCE, transmitted Mesopotamian traditions to Hellenistic audiences, describing catastrophes that shaped the region's deep history. Through such transmission, Sumerian memories reached Mediterranean world, influencing how later civilizations understood cosmic conflict and divine judgment. Then the knowledge truly died. Cuneiform writing ceased around the 1st century CE. The last persons who could read Akkadian and Sumerian vanished from history. For 17 centuries the tablets lay buried and illegible, their wedge-shaped marks meaningless, their stories silent. Libraries that had preserved them for 3,000 years became archaeological deposits. Knowledge transformed into artifacts awaiting rediscovery. The rediscovery began in the 19th century. European archaeologists excavating Mesopotamian tells, shipping thousands of tablets to museums in London, Paris, Berlin, but the tablets remained mute until scholars painstakingly deciphered cuneiform, a process taking decades of comparative work. Henry Rawlinson's work on the Behistun inscription provided keys. George Smith's dramatic reading of the flood narrative in 1872 demonstrated that biblical stories had Mesopotamian antecedents, scandalizing Victorian audiences and revolutionizing biblical scholarship. The lamentation texts emerged more slowly. Translating Sumerian, unrelated to any known language family, required building understanding from scratch. Each newly translated tablet added pieces to a puzzle whose full scope only gradually became apparent. By the early 20th century, scholars recognized the catastrophe narratives as coherent genre, historical accounts of real events filtered through religious interpretation. Archaeological excavation provided physical context. Leonard Woolley at Ur, Sidney Smith at Uruk, excavations at Nippur and Lagash, all revealed destruction layers, corroborating textual chronology. Cities had fallen around 2000 BCE. The collapse was real. The question became how to interpret causes, how to understand what the texts were actually describing. Still today, new tablets emerge from museum collections, awaiting translation. Thousands of cuneiform texts have been photographed and catalogued, but not fully studied, each potentially containing new information. Digital humanities projects are creating searchable databases, allowing researchers to identify patterns across vast textual corpora. What was impossible for earlier generations becomes routine with modern computing. Comparative analysis of weapon descriptions, geographic distribution of destruction references, chronological patterns across different text types. Modern scientific methods add layers previous investigations couldn't access. Satellite imagery reveals ancient watercourses and settlement patterns invisible from ground level. Ground-penetrating radar locates structures beneath tells too large to excavate completely. Chemical analysis of destruction layers provides data about temperature, materials burned, environmental conditions. DNA analysis of skeletal remains reveals population movements, dietary changes, disease patterns. Climate science reconstructs ancient weather with increasing precision. Ice cores from Greenland preserve atmospheric chemistry from 4,000 years ago. Tree rings from long-lived species create chronologies, extending back millennia. Lake sediments record vegetation changes reflecting rainfall patterns. These independent data sources confirm that severe drought did affect the Near East around 2200 to 2000 BCE, validating one component of the catastrophe narrative. Even now, Iraqi and international archaeologists work at sites mentioned in the Lamentation texts, uncovering new evidence, refining chronologies, testing hypotheses. Political instability has complicated this work. Many sites damaged or looted during recent conflicts, yet investigations continue. Patient accumulation of knowledge that will take generations to complete. The questions the tablets pose remain as relevant now as when Victorian scholars first translated them. How do we interpret ancient testimony about events exceeding expected capabilities, when physical evidence confirms catastrophe but leaves causes ambiguous? How do we choose between competing explanations? What weight do we give to descriptions that seem impossible versus patterns suggesting our frameworks might be incomplete? These aren't just academic questions. They touch fundamental issues about how we understand the past, how we read evidence, what possibilities we're willing to consider. The Sumerian catastrophes force us to confront the limits of certainty, the persistence of mystery, the humility required when dealing with fragmentary evidence from distant ages. The legacy extends beyond scholarship into popular consciousness. The Anunnaki have become cultural symbols, appearing in literature, film, alternative history theories, conspiracy narratives. Some interpretations remain grounded in archaeological evidence. Others venture into speculation that mainstream scholarship rejects. Both engage with fundamental questions the tablets raise about human origins, divine intervention, technological capabilities of ancient peoples. You listening tonight become part of this unbroken chain of transmission. The scribes who first pressed these accounts into clay 4,000 years ago intended them to be remembered, copied, transmitted forward. Through centuries of careful preservation, through catastrophic forgetting and painstaking recovery, through translation and interpretation spanning cultures and millennia, these stories have reached you here, in this moment, in this darkness. The same stars the Sumerians watched still wheel overhead, following paths established long before civilization began. The same questions that troubled ancient witnesses still trouble us. What causes catastrophes that exceed normal experience? How do we preserve memory across civilizational collapse? What truths might be hidden in stories we've dismissed as myth? The tablets rest in climate-controlled museums now, their clay miraculously preserved by the fires that destroyed everything else. They still speak to anyone willing to learn cuneiform, to engage with ancient worldviews, to sit with mystery rather than demanding premature answers. The war of the gods, whether literal or metaphorical, natural or technological, ended an age 4,000 years ago, but the questions it raised continue, patient as the clay that preserves them, waiting for new generations to wonder, to investigate, to imagine what truths might still lie hidden in humanity's oldest written memories of catastrophe. The story doesn't end. It continues in us, in our curiosity about the past, in our willingness to engage with mysteries that resist simple resolution. And perhaps that's exactly what those ancient scribes intended, preserving not just information but invitation to wonder that transcends time itself. The journey we've taken tonight stretches across 4,000 years, from catastrophes that ended Sumerian civilization to questions we still ask in the darkness of modern nights. It's a long span by human measure, barely a breath in the lifetime of stars that watched whatever occurred in those distant days when cities fell and the earth bore wounds. Wherever you are right now, whatever room holds you in this moment, notice the quiet surrounding you, The war of the gods, whether divine conflict or human catastrophe or natural disaster mythologized through religious language, has long since ended. The cities mentioned in the lamentation texts lie beneath Iraqi sands. Their mud brick walls return to the earth from which they were formed. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, though their courses have shifted, carrying silt and memory toward the Gulf where Sumerian ships once sailed. The stars haven't changed. The same constellations the priest astronomers tracked still turn overhead, following paths established before humanity learned to write. Venus still appears as morning and evening star, rising and setting in cycles that outlast civilizations. The moon waxes and wanes through phases that witnessed Sumerian prosperity and Sumerian collapse with equal indifference. The patterns continue, patient as they've always been, caring nothing for the questions we ask beneath them. We don't know with certainty what happened in Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE. The tablets preserve testimony that allows multiple interpretations. The archaeological evidence confirms catastrophe, but leaves causes ambiguous. Perhaps it was climate collapse amplified by political fragmentation, drought and warfare mythologized as divine conflict. Perhaps natural disasters, meteor impacts or volcanic eruptions, produced effects ancient witnesses described in available vocabulary. Perhaps something stranger occurred, events that don't fit comfortably into our categories of possible and impossible. The mystery doesn't diminish the inquiry. If anything, the uncertainty preserves something valuable, the recognition that not everything yields to investigation, that some questions remain open across millennia of study. The Sumerians themselves might have understood this, recording events they couldn't fully explain, preserving testimony they knew was incomplete, trusting that the questions mattered even when answers eluded them. Take a breath. Let yourself settle fully into this moment. The exploration is ending, but the questions continue. They'll be there tomorrow, patient as the clay tablets that preserve them, waiting for anyone curious enough to ask. There's no urgency, no need to resolve what 4,000 years haven't resolved. The mystery has survived this long. It will survive longer still. The wind moves across the Mesopotamian plain tonight, the same wind that scattered ash over Ur's ruins 4 millennia ago, that whispers through the exposed foundations of temples, where gods supposedly received offerings and issued commands. Somewhere beneath the sand lie tablets not yet discovered, stories not yet translated, fragments of memory waiting patiently for the right moment of revelation. And you, listening here in darkness, you're connected to all of it, to the scribes who pressed warnings into clay, to the survivors who composed lamentations, to the archaeologists who uncovered ruins, to everyone who ever wondered what truths might hide in stories dismissed as myth, what realities might underlie accounts that seem impossible. The Anunnaki, whether gods or kings or visitors or archetypes or something beyond all categories, rest in silence now. Their weapons are gone, dissolved into legend and speculation. Their cities are dust, preserved only in museums and excavation reports. But the questions they raise about catastrophe, about memory, about humanity's relationship to forces beyond understanding, these questions live on, finding new voices in each generation that encounters them. Rest easy. The night continues its ancient patterns. The earth turns toward dawn regardless of what mysteries it holds. And the tablets, patient as stone, continue their long conversation with time itself, speaking to anyone willing to listen with humility and wonder. The story ends where it began, in silence and uncertainty, in questions without final answers, in the vast stillness that holds both catastrophe and continuity, both destruction and preservation. The same stars watch, the same rivers flow, and somewhere in the darkness, clay and memory wait, holding their secrets gently, releasing them slowly to those who approach with patience rather than certainty. The wind still moves over ruins, the tablets still speak, and the mystery, ancient and enduring, continues its patient vigil across time, that measures itself not in years, but in the slow turning of constellations, in the gradual erosion of mountains, in the persistent question marks that humanity leaves carved into stone and pressed into clay, asking future generations to wonder as we have wondered, to seek as we have sought, to rest finally in the acceptance that some truths remain forever, just beyond our grasp, visible in shadows, present in silence, speaking most clearly when we stop demanding answers and simply